The first time you notice the illusion of control, it is small and almost tender. A cup of coffee swung just so it doesn't spill, keys arranged in a predictable clink on the table, a playlist cued to the precise mood you want to inhabit. These are tiny theaters where you are director, lighting designer, and audience all at once. You pull levers, a choice here, a precaution there, and the world bows politely, as if grateful for the choreographed order. But control is not an object you hold. It is a posture you adopt, a quiet insistence that by arranging a few small things you can forestall the vast, indifferent weather of chance. We like to believe we can shape outcomes because the alternative is a confrontation with vertigo. To sit in the raw presence of uncertainty is to feel the ground under you dissolve into a shifting mosaic. So we build, we name, we schedule, we predict. We tell stories about cause and effect and pattern until the raw, messy world agrees to look like a story. Yet the very act of making that story, of carving a plot from the formless, is also a sign of our vulnerability. The imagination that invents control is the same imagination that feels how fragile life is. There is tenderness in that fragility. There is bravery in the tiny rituals we perform to feel safe. But there is also a cost. When we confuse the map for the territory, when plans become promises to ourselves that must not be broken, the world becomes a test we are obliged to pass. Every failure becomes a reflection not merely of circumstance but of character. We measure ourselves by the degree to which events obey us, and so when they don't, shame arrives, quiet and pungent. We are left asking the old, helpless questions. Why me? Why now? What did I do wrong? To speak of control is to speak of illusion because what feels like control is often an approximation produced by attention and memory. The mind selects evidence that confirms its mastery. The times the umbrella kept you dry, the moments a conversation went exactly as rehearsed, and lets other moments dissolve into background noise. This selective memory knits a comfortable narrative. I can steer my life, but catastrophe, chance, and the small betrayals of the body remind us that mastery is partial and conditional. The illusion is not malicious, it is adaptive. It helps us act, yet it also makes us brittle. Brittleness manifests in the way we relate to one another. There is a loneliness in modern attempts to control. We seek autonomy as if it were the summit of moral achievement. Autonomy feels noble, the self-reliant individual who needs no one, but lived as a value without balance, it erodes the fabric that keeps us resilient. Community is not a soothing add-on, it is structural. When a person or a society places undue weight on flawless control, it privatizes failure. People hunch over their disappointments in solitude, polishing their masks of competence, while beneath those masks the small fractures spread. Yet there is a paradox at the heart of this tension between individuality and community. The very impulse to control can be a crucible for creativity. When we cannot command circumstances, imagination becomes our instrument. Artists, scientists, and ordinary people invent compensations, rituals, and models that bend the world not by brute force but by reinterpretation. When prediction fails, we improvise. The person who once relied on plans learns to make improvisation an art, a skill in rapid revaluation, in seeing connections others miss. Loneliness tightens and then, strangely, widens into a field where new forms grow because there is no authority dictating what must be done. In that space, radical possibilities appear. Unexpected friendships, improvised songs, alliances forged out of need rather than design. But creativity born from constraint can also be lonely because it demands risk. To create is to expose the interior to the outside, to let others see what has been cobbled together in the dark. This exposure invites judgment, misunderstanding, and sometimes harm. So the creative person oscillates between surrender and defense. Surrender in the sense of trusting that something larger than calculation will carry them. Defense in the sense of protecting the fragile experiment that is their work. This dance between surrender and control shapes not only art but the way we live our lives. How much to hold? How much to let go? There is no universal answer, only a practice that must be tailored to temperaments, histories, and contingencies. Surrender is a word that scares people who equate it with defeat. But there are many kinds of surrender. There is the surrender of resignation, the passive acceptance that shrinks the self. And there is the surrender of acknowledgement, a deliberate recognition of what cannot be changed coupled with an active reallocation of energy. This is not giving up, it is strategic release. When we surrender the illusion that we can micromanage everything, we free psychic resources to attend to what truly matters. Relationships, values, the small acts of meaning that persist when plans fail. Psychologically, this resembles the practice of acceptance, not as fatalism but as clarity of choice. When you are honest with what is outside your control, you stop expending precious effort on the impossible. Instead, you apply that effort where it can move mountains, not by forcing the mountain but by altering your approach to it. Philosophically, it is akin to an ancient map restudied. Stoics named the boundary between what depends on us and what does not. Buddhists pointed to the suffering produced by clinging to transient things. Existentialists invited us to take responsibility for the meanings we create in an indifferent world. These are not doctrines to imitate mechanically. They are tools to practice. Practice matters because insight alone does not immunize us from the old reflexes. The first time the airport announces a delay, the old muscles of control flex and strain. We rearrange, we plead, we look for explanations. Later we may remember the theory that delays are beyond most of our sway, but theory is not a substitute for habit. That is why resilient living requires both philosophy and choreography, an intellectual map and bodily practice that condition the nervous system to respond differently. Breathing, ritual, chosen speech, communal confession, art making. These are somatic and social technologies that rewire us toward flexibility. Community enters here not as an abstract antidote, but as a living mechanism for resilience. There is a dignity in collective weakness, a mutual exchange of failure and repair that ordinary people can perform when social norms allow vulnerability. Think of a neighborhood that shares rides when weather shutters the bus, or of a family that sits vigil, not to fix death but to hold space for grief. Such acts recalibrate our sense of agency. Agency need not be solitary, can be distributed, porous, generous. When we accept that our control is partial, we are more likely to invite others into our troubles and to become people others can invite into theirs. Conflict will arise in such porous systems because control and surrender are not evenly distributed. They are entangled with power, fear, and history. Those who have accumulated more control, through wealth, status, or social position, may resist practices that threaten their dominance. Those who have less may fight for control as a means of dignity. The result is a political ecology where personal and communal practices of surrender become moralized. Is surrender cowardice, or is it wisdom? Is insistence on control noble autonomy, or is it a refusal to share power? These are not merely intellectual debates. They sculpt public life. Loneliness, creativity, conflict. These are not separate threads but braids of the same rope. Each arises from the interplay between the desire to shape our private lives and the undeniable fact of shared vulnerability. The person who insists on total self-sufficiency will at times spark creativity in defiance of constraint, but they will also lose the tender ballast of mutual aid. The person who yields too readily may be absorbed into others' designs and lose the capacity to innovate. The living question is how to balance, not by rules but by orientation, a constant, humble checking of where your power is being spent and to what end. So what does resilience look like in this landscape? It looks less like ironclad certainty and more like elasticity. It looks like people who keep attachments, but hold them lightly. It looks like institutions that value repair over punishment, conversation over proclamation. It looks like daily rituals that teach the body to recalibrate when chaos arrives. The evening of reflection, the ritual of asking for help, the rehearsal of saying, "I don't know," without shame. It looks like communities that practice grief together, not as pathology but as maintenance. These are not cosmetic choices. They are structural adaptations. They require courage because they demand vulnerability, the willingness to be seen as incomplete and to trust others not to exploit that incompleteness. Consider, for a moment, the moral imagination, our capacity to envision alternate responses to pain and disorder. It is in this imagination that hope resides. Not the hopeful delusion that we can prevent every misfortune, but the quieter hope that we can respond with creativity, with tenderness, with a repaired fabric of connection. Hope recognizes constraints and still chooses action that affirms life. It is a practice. Small, repeated, generous. Finally, ask yourself, not as a thesis but as a question to sit with tonight. What of your life do you tend to treat as furniture that must never move? What rituals, relationships, or beliefs do you guard with a fierce illusion? And conversely, where have you already learned to loosen your grip, to let the world surprise you and in that surprise become more alive? These are not tests to pass. They are invitations to examine how your very attempts to control shape the texture of your days. The illusion of control is, in the end, an intimate companion. It tells us we can and should order the chaos, but it also reveals what we value: safety, predictability, dignity. If we can learn to treat control not as an absolute but as one instrument among many, we may stand less rigid and more generous. We may find that surrender, far from erasing the self, refines it. A self that knows its limits, tends its courage, and reaches toward others with hands capable of both building and letting go. The night after the first small betrayals of control, the flight canceled, the job unexpectedly folded, the body that once obeyed now hiccuping with ache, there is a silence that is not empty but full of questions. Those questions gather like moths around the porch light of the mind. What did I miscalculate? Where did my map fail? Who will help me now? They are patient, persistent, and strangely intimate. In that hour, we learn another shape of the illusion. It is not merely the belief that events will bend to our will, but the story we tell about ourselves when they don't. When plans unravel, we discover the narratives that have been propping up our identity: the competent worker, the reliable partner, the moral person, and we watch them thin. Sometimes they snap, and then what remains is not a tragedy but an open space. Open spaces terrify because they are invitations to remake the self. Yet this remaking is not always violent or sudden. More often it is a slow accretion of small choices that say, in effect, I will try a different translation. Consider the person whose career vanishes overnight. One route is to treat the loss as a mirror of failure and retreat into private blame. Another is to treat it as data, a factual change in circumstances that necessitates new strategies. The second path does not erase disappointment, but it reframes the narrative from deficiency to experiment. It asks less, who am I if I cannot do X? And more, what can I become because X is no longer possible? This is not Stoic platitude. It is a pragmatic reorientation that shifts energy from self-condemnation to exploration. Yet reorientation requires tools. Philosophy hands us one set: conceptual lenses that reframe chaos into intelligible patterns. Psychology hands us another: techniques to regulate the organism so it can use reason without being hijacked by fear. The practical unity between these disciplines is an ethic of micro-practices, small, repeatable acts that recalibrate nervous systems and narratives alike. One such practice is the inventory of contingencies, a daily habit of listing what about today depended on you and what did not. It trains attention to differentiate agency from circumstance. Another is the micro-surrender, deliberately choosing to leave a trivial outcome to chance, taking a different route home, letting someone else pick the movie, to relearn how it feels when things don't conform to your plan. These small exercises are not indulgences. They are bodily rehearsals in humility. Humility is often misread as meekness. True humility is a different animal entirely. It is a clear-sighted appraisal of the extent and limits of one's influence, married to a generosity of intent. It allows action without the tyranny of certainty. There are practices that cultivate it: asking curious questions instead of making declarative statements, making a public admission of ignorance in a group, or practicing soft predictions, offering forecasts in probabilistic language rather than categorical certainty. Such moves change interpersonal dynamics. They invite collaboration because they signal that you do not assume omniscience. They also soften the social pressure to perform omnipotence, which, when unmet, breeds secrecy and shame. Community, again, appears as both refuge and rehearsal space. The person who lives among people who can tolerate imperfection learns a different grammar of failure. In such communities, Mistakes are not final verdicts but opportunities for repair. Repair is a verb. It implies returning to something broken with intention and tools. In families and neighborhoods, repair can be mundane, fixing a leaking roof together, and that mundane labor is philosophically rich because it enacts a model of interdependence. On a larger scale, societies that institutionalize repair through healthcare systems that prioritize recovery, workplaces that allow phased returns, legal systems that favor restoration, create environments where surrender does not equate to abandonment. They create a social infrastructure that recognizes fragility as normal and manageable, not exceptional and shameful. There is a political dimension to the illusion of control that cannot be ignored. Societies enamored with predictability and efficiency tend to design brittle systems. Highly optimized supply chains that shave away redundancy perform beautifully until an unforeseen shock arrives. Then they crack. The lesson is mechanistic but moral. Efficiency without slack is a form of hubris. A wise polity preserves redundancy, the communal equivalent of a backup generator. Public spaces where people practice mutual aid, labor protections that allow for downtime, and cultural narratives that honor rest as a civic good are not luxuries. They are resilience strategies. The political project, therefore, becomes one of designing systems that assume human limitation rather than pretending it away. Loneliness, again, is woven into these political and personal threads. The modern architecture of life, towns built for cars, work organized in isolated silos, status measured by curated competence, produces bodies and minds that are unaccustomed to dependency. Yet dependency, if reframed, is not servility but interbeing. It is the recognition that to be human is to be knitted to others in a web of mutual need. What would it look like if we designed institutions and rituals that rehearse dependency as something tender and reciprocal? Imagine rites of communal caregiving that are ordinary as grocery shopping, or work cultures where asking for help is as routine as giving progress updates. The psychological benefits are practical. Lowered stress, increased cognitive bandwidth for creative thought, and a stronger safety net against catastrophic isolation. Creativity, oddly enough, thrives within these constraints. There is an aesthetic logic to necessity. Poets and scientists alike discover new forms when their options narrow. But creativity also needs audience, feedback, and the courage to risk ridicule. The interplay between control and surrender here becomes aesthetic. Control shapes craft. Surrender invites novelty. One practice that emerges from this insight is the public experiment. Share early and rough work with a trusted circle to test ideas, gather reactions, and iterate. This practice converts the fear of judgment into an engine for refinement. It is humility in action, saying, "I do not know if this works. Will you help me see?" And the help, when offered, humanizes both giver and receiver. At the individual level, there are also deeper philosophical practices that reorient suffering. The Stoic reminder to distinguish between what is in our control and what is not is useful only if translated into day-to-day language and bodily habit. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, does this translation. It teaches people to open to unpleasant experiences while committing to values-driven action. Mindfulness practices accomplish a related change by decoupling sensations from narratives. The body can feel fear without the mind manufacturing catastrophic stories about identity. Combining such techniques with communal rituals, for instance, group meditations followed by shared reflection, creates an ecology where inner regulation and outer connection reinforce each other. And then there is faith, not necessarily religious, but faith as trust in processes larger than immediate desire. Faith is not belief in a deterministic script, but confidence in the possibility of meaning-making. It can be cultivated by telling stories of repair aloud, by preserving artifacts of past recoveries, by keeping records of times you survived a storm. These are small memorials that remind you of your durable capacities. They are counterweights to the catastrophic imaginations that the illusion of control often masks. Before the second sunrise, when the house is still and the questions have softened from accusatory to curious, there is a chance to practice a different kind of inquiry. One that asks not how to command life, but how to attune to it. What rhythms can you align with instead of resisting? What people can you invite into a shared experiment of care? What tiny acts of surrender could you practice tomorrow to know what it feels like to be sustained without constant control? These are not tests. They are invitations to expand the repertoire of living. To live under the recognition that control is partial is to inhabit a middle tone between arrogance and despair. It is to choose daily, stubbornly, to act with courage and humility, to build and to unbuild, to create and to repair. It is to relearn that loneliness does not have to be the default reaction to uncertainty, that creativity thrives when it is shared, and that resilience is not a private muscle but a communal organ. So tonight, as you put the day away, try a small experiment. Name one thing you will intentionally let happen without your intervention tomorrow. Allow the bus to be late, skip a checked email, let dinner plans be chosen by someone else, and notice not only the outcome but what arises inside you. Curiosity more than judgment. Compassion more than performance. Over time, those tiny allowances knit a different habit in the nervous system. The capacity to be steady amidst the storm, to open where we would otherwise close, and to find, in the shared work of being human, the soft architecture that makes life livable. There is a moment, subtle and crystalline, when the imagination begins to make friends with uncertainty. It arrives not as a thunderclap but as a small, almost imperceptible loosening, the realization that the future is not a single track but a braided river of possibilities. This recognition can be exhilarating and terrifying in the same breath. Exhilarating because it hints at unforeseen doors, terrifying because it undoes the comfort of a single, predictable story. In that braided space, the self finds an unexpected companion: doubt. We have been taught to treat doubt as a failure of conviction, a weakness to be hushed. But doubt, properly tended, can be a form of moral humility and creative intelligence. It forces us to rebalance our hunger for control with a readiness to adapt. Imagine doubt as a lantern, not a condemnation. It reveals not only shadows but also alternative paths. When a leader doubts, they may slow down decisions long enough to include voices that would otherwise be excluded. When an artist doubts, they may risk an experiment that renders a new aesthetic. When a lover doubts, they may ask a question that prevents a lifetime of assumption. Doubt, then, does not dissolve agency. It refines it. It demands that action be accountable, provisional, and open to correction. This is a different kind of power, one that acknowledges limits and invites participation rather than enforcing a solitary will. The psychologies that help cultivate such mature doubt are often practical and unsensational. Cognitive reframing, for example, teaches us to hold multiple narratives about the same event. Narrative therapy helps people separate the problem from the person so identity does not calcify around failure. But beyond techniques, there is an ethical practice: pledge to curiosity. Curiosity as a vow is deceptively simple. It substitutes the posture of "I must be right" with "I want to learn." This change in orientation is seismic. It turns conversations from contests into explorations. It converts the urge to be impermeable, to protect the self by hoarding certainty, into an appetite for nuance. What would your life look like if curiosity, not certainty, were the default? Curiosity invites us back into the communal field because it requires witnesses. To ask a genuine question is to create space for another to answer, and in answering, to be affirmed. This reciprocity is the antidote to a loneliness born of performative competence. It is one of the simplest designs for social repair. Teach people to ask and teach them to listen. The craft of listening is not passive. It is an active posture of attention that validates and transforms. We can make listening into a public technology, training children in attentive dialogue, structuring meetings around questions rather than bullet points, instituting listening hours in offices and neighborhoods. These are small civic inventions, and yet their cumulative effect could be vast. But questions about doubt and curiosity soon brush up against power. Power loves certainty. Systems built on hierarchy and domination depend on confident assertions. They thrive when dissent is delegitimized as ignorance or disloyalty. Therefore, any movement toward communal humility must reckon with the fact that surrendering the illusion of control implicates social structures. The personal work of letting go cannot be fully effective without structural shifts that reduce the penalties of vulnerability. To be willing to say, "I don't know" at work or in public must not invite punishment. This is a political problem as much as a moral one. Societies must decide whether they will valorize infallibility or reparable fallibility. Which model do you want to live under? Beyond institutions, there is a quieter theater where the drama of control and surrender plays out. Intimate relationships. Here the stakes are visceral. When partners conflate love with mastery of schedules, moods, expectations, they create a pressure cooker. They become co-authors of a script where deviations are betrayals. The healthier alternative is a grammar of negotiation. Ongoing, imperfect, and humane. Negotiation does not mean endless conflict. It means continuous recalibration. It is the practice of asking, "Is this arrangement still working for us?" rather than assuming permanence. Rituals of renegotiation, scheduled check-ins where grievances are aired and small agreements revised, can transform relationships from static contracts into living covenants. Such rituals teach us to shepherd expectations rather than to hem them in with brittle certainty. Grief deserves its own kind of compassionate attention in this conversation because loss is where control shows its face most starkly. The death of a loved one, the end of a career, the collapse of a dream. These moments do not merely test our strategies. They rewrite the grammar of meaning. People often rush to narrative closure. Ergo, find the lesson, extract the moral, restore equilibrium. Yet grief resists tidy summaries. Sometimes meaning emerges slowly and inconveniently, in ways that embarrass our earlier convictions. The philosophical approach here is not to insist on meaning at all costs, but to tolerate meaninglessness long enough for new meanings to accrue. Psychologically, resilient grieving combines the acceptance of despair with the slow reattachment to life's pleasures. It is not denial, and it is not reckless optimism. It is a long, patient tending of the interior garden until new shoots appear, which brings us inevitably to play. Play is often trivialized, but it is one of the most sophisticated technologies for living with uncertainty. When children play, they rehearse worlds where rules shift, outcomes surprise, and improvisation is rewarded. Adults who retain playfulness maintain cognitive flexibility and emotional resilience. Play teaches us to risk small losses, a lost piece in a game, a joke that fails, and to continue. It trains the nervous system to recover from surprise. Moreover, play is an ethic of communal experimentation. It depends on mutual consent to explore possibilities without catastrophic stakes. How might workplaces and families include structured play to build tolerance for unpredictability? The answer is not to infantilize adults, but to organize low-stakes spaces where creativity and error are encouraged. There is also a spiritual dimension to cultivating an acceptance of uncertainty. Many spiritual traditions emphasize practices of surrender that are not fatalistic but transformative. Prayer, meditation, pilgrimage, and ritual sacrifice teach the practitioner to orient toward something larger than immediate wants. They cultivate patience, awe, and a willingness to steward life rather than dominate it. These practices are not uniformly religious. They can be secularized into practices of awe, spending time in nature, listening to music that overwhelms, making offerings that symbolize devotion to values rather than outcomes. Such practices recalibrate priorities. They remind us that meaning often accrues through participation and witness rather than through control. Technology complicates this landscape in peculiar ways. On one hand, it extends our capacities, allowing us to coordinate, predict, and respond in ways never before possible. On the other hand, it fuels an illusion of total surveillance and management. The more we develop algorithms intended to remove uncertainty, the more brittle our social fabric may become if those algorithms fail or are wielded by actors who benefit from opacity. The ethical task here is to build technologies that assume failure and provide visible, democratic mechanisms for repair. Transparency, auditability, and deliberate redundancy are not merely engineering choices. They are moral commitments to a world that accepts limitation. Finally, on the level of the individual psyche, there is a practice that stitches many of these threads together: narrative generosity. Narrative generosity is the capacity to tell stories of yourself and others that leave room for contradiction, growth, and rescue. It resists the urge to reduce a life to a headline. When you are generous with your own story, you allow for failure, apology, and transformation. When you are generous with others' stories, you permit them the dignity of complexity. This practice mitigates shame because shame feeds on blunt narratives that reduce people to single traits. Narrative generosity creates a culture where mistakes are contextualized, where repentance is possible, and where repair can be luminous. So ask yourself now, gently, where in your life could you practice narrative generosity? Who have you shrunk into a simple plot so you could feel safer? Where might you invite more curiosity, more playful experimentation, more rituals of renegotiation? And on a broader civic scale, what institutions around you require redesign to assume human frailty rather than to punish it? These are not rhetorical traps, but portals. They invite small experiments, one conversation, one meeting redesigned, one ritual introduced, that, aggregated over time, shift the texture of living. The illusion of control does not vanish because we understand it. Its seductions are subtle and recurring. But understanding opens a second door, the possibility of designing our habits, institutions, and inner lives in ways that accept contingency without surrendering courage. To live in that second door is to become an artisan of unpredictability, someone who crafts vessels that can both hold and release, who builds with materials that bend rather than break. It is to remember that the richest parts of life often arrive unannounced, and that the capacity to receive them arises from a practiced readiness to be surprised. There is an undercurrent to all our striving for control that is seldom named: the body's memory. Long before the mind constructs narratives and plans, the chest tightens, the gut knots, the muscles prepare for fight or flight. We are organisms first and storytellers second. The nervous system writes its own biography in sweat, in breath, in the temperature of our hands. This autobiography often predates our conscious beliefs about control. A parent who learned, as a child, that unpredictability meant danger will have a body that prepares for catastrophe even when the evidence says otherwise. A community that endured famine or violence will carry protocols of vigilance like architectural features, passed down as gestures and mannered silence. To change the story of control, we must attend to these physical archives. Thought without bodily practice is like a map with no roads. So the work becomes somatic as much as intellectual. Practices that repattern the body are not afterthoughts. They are primary technologies for living with uncertainty. Breath that steadies the heart, slow walking that loosens the spine, the simple ritual of touch that affirms presence. Each is a council of small acts that teach the nervous system a new grammar. Therapy is a form of retraining. So too are group practices that rehearse vulnerability at scale. Imagine a circle where people name their anxieties aloud, not to be fixed by advice, but to be heard and mirrored. The mirror of another's attention changes physiology. The release of secrecy recalibrates threat responses. These are not indulgent intimacies. They are corrective practices that realign body and story. Ethically, this insistence on somatic care has consequences for how we imagine responsibility. If the body stores trauma, then social remedies must be bodily too. Accessible healthcare, routine rest embedded in labor policy, spaces in schools where children learn regulation not as compliance but as competence. This is not a sentimental plea for kindness alone. It is a demand for practical justice. To expect people to perform in high-stakes environments without offering systems that recalibrate their bodies is to weaponize ignorance. The moral arc bends toward institutions that heal the organism, not only punish its failures. There is also an aesthetics to surrender that is easily missed. Surrender is never merely erasure of force. It can be the opening of a different craft. Think of a jazz musician who yields to a solo, listening intently in the middle of play, letting the line emerge from interplay rather than imposition. Surrender in art is listening to materials, to accidents, to the voice of the medium. In life, surrender can be the cultivation of a sensibility that responds to contingencies with improvisational grace. It asks for discipline, paradoxically. The discipline to notice, the discipline to refrain from immediate correction, the discipline to allow an emergent form to take shape. This is not passivity. It is a rigorous attunement to nuance. Risk is the currency of this attunement. To surrender strategically requires discernment about where risk is acceptable and where firmness is necessary. It turns out there are wise forms of risk, ones that are bounded, reversible, and communal. A bounded risk is an experiment in a lab, not life or death gambit. A reversible risk allows for repair if the outcome is undesirable. A communal risk distributes potential harm and benefit, reducing the burden on any single person. Designing life around these sorts of risks, job transitions trialed through part-time projects, relationships negotiated through honest exploration, public policies rolled out as pilot studies with feedback, creates an architecture where surrender need not mean exposure to catastrophic harm. It turns surrender into a method rather than a fatalism. But the capacity to judge risk well is unevenly distributed. That is the blunt political fact. People with privilege can afford many experiments. People without it cannot. Here again, the moral imagination must move beyond individual practices to collective arrangements. Insurance, universal basic services, legal protections for experimentation, these are not abstractions but enablers of a culture of adaptive surrender. If only the wealthy can safely release control, then surrender becomes a luxury, not a practice available to all. Justice, therefore, requires designing conditions under which many can experiment without ruin. When the aesthetic of surrender and the politics of risk meet, new cultural possibilities emerge. Rituals can be deliberately crafted to socialize the acceptance of uncertainty. Weddings that are shorter and less theatrical but include public vows of mutual assistance. Workplaces that publish stories of failed projects with analyses of learning. Schools that grade process as well as product so that students learn to value iteration. The point is to make practices that normalize not the triumph of control but the skill of repair. Rituals institutionalize humility. They make vulnerability public in a way that reduces shame because the exposure is shared. Shared exposure becomes shared responsibility. Forgiveness is another quiet mechanism in this ecology. When we forgive both ourselves and others, we reclaim psychic space that would otherwise be consumed by retribution. Forgiveness is not forgetting nor excusing harm without accountability. It is a reallocation of attention from punishment to repair. Societies that practice restorative justice show how forgiveness, when coupled with restitution and truth-telling, can renew social bonds and reduce cycles of harm. On the personal level, forgiveness is a radical relinquishing of the demand for perfect outcomes. It is an admission that people are fallible and that relationships are long projects rather than instantaneous verdicts. Art and narrative continue to play a crucial role here because they offer safe vicarious exposure to disaster and repair. Stories allow us to simulate alternative responses to chaos. Reading a novel where characters survive betrayal by creating new alliances teaches neural patterns for resilience. Films that depict repair in process model humility and the messy work of reconstruction. Encouraging a culture that prizes such narratives, public libraries, community theaters, storytelling events, builds collective muscle memory for living with uncertainty. Practical tools accumulate from these reflections. Keep a failure album. A small notebook where you record experiments that went wrong and what they taught you. Practice public drafts. Share early versions of your work with a trusted group to normalize feedback and iteration. Build repair rituals. Short, codified steps your family or workplace follows when things break. Acknowledge, listen, make a plan, celebrate the repair. Allocate redundant time. Purposefully unscheduled half-days that act as buffers against the tyranny of efficiency. These are banal, perhaps, but they change the texture of daily life because they redirect energy away from polishing an appearance of omniscience and toward sustainable thriving. And still, the deepest work is inward. There are moments when you must sit with your resistance to not knowing. You must observe the stories that insist you be invulnerable, notice where they came from, and then decide whether they deserve to govern your days. This is quiet work, a journal entry, a small confession to a friend, a therapy session, a pause before answering. It requires patience because the mind loves quick fixes. It requires courage because once you begin to loosen the grip of certainty, you will meet your loneliness and your smallness. That meeting is not a threat. It is an initiation. On the far side of it is a gentler, more capacious life. Before you close this part and return to the world, carry this simple experiment into the next day. Choose one small decision: what to wear, which route to take, what to cook. and decide it by throwing a lightweight kind of chance into the process. A coin, a number, a child's choice. Observe your inner commentary. Where did you feel loss and where unexpected relief? Ask yourself what that commentary reveals about what you have been defending. Over time, these tiny contests with certainty create a new habit, not of surrender as defeat, but of surrender as a practiced, aesthetic, ethical stance. They teach the body and mind that the world is not a ledger to be balanced, but a conversation to be entered with curiosity, courage, and companions. There are seasons in life when uncertainty ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes a climate that shapes every decision. You find yourself waking to a different gravity. Relationships shifted, markets changed, bodies aged, climate patterns altered. The quotidian becomes an ongoing negotiation with surprise. In these seasons, the strategies that once sufficed feel threadbare. The mind searches for a single authority, a manual, a guru, a definitive course, and when it cannot be found, the temptation to panic is acute. Yet panic is not the only possible response. There is another rhythm. Slow tending, one careful action after another, practiced with attention and without the delusion of finality. This is the work of stewardship, tending people, projects, and selves through seasons rather than trying to make them permanently frostproof. Stewardship accepts temporality as design constraint. It recognizes that things live and die, flourish and falter, and that our responsibility is not to prevent that arc but to steward it conscientiously. Stewardship asks different questions than mastery. Instead of, how do I make this last forever? It asks, how do I attend well while it lasts? How do I prepare for transitions with care? How do I leave systems more hospitable for those who follow? Stewardship reframes control from possession to caretaking. This is a moral pivot, from hoarding stability to cultivating resilience. It requires different virtues: patience, foresight, humility about what can be foreseen, and toughness to do the small, often thankless work of maintenance. Maintenance is underrated. It is rarer to write elegies for the keeper of the community garden than for the visionary who promises revolution, but the world depends on both. Maintenance is the daily practice of seeing what is fraying and repairing it before collapse. It is the gentle labor of readying knots, clearing paths, replacing batteries, calling a friend back, apologizing, checking on the aging parent. These acts are unspectacular but morally significant because they prevent small fractures from becoming catastrophic breaks. A culture that honors maintenance will look different than one that glorifies sudden achievement. It will invest in caretaking professions, normalize long-term planning over short-term triumphs, and build incentives for repair rather than replacement. At the same time, stewardship must be paired with experimentalism. A steward who refuses to adapt becomes a fossil. The paradox of good stewardship is that it protects value by being willing to change it. This requires an institutional imagination. Create practices that allow for small-scale experimentation within the bounds of care. A hospital might run pilot programs in patient-centered scheduling. A school might allow teachers to try new curricula with cohort feedback loops. A company might fund skunkworks projects that are insulated from short-term profit demands. Such designs permit innovation without endangering the things that matter. They are structures that say, we will protect our community while also inviting novelty. Psychologically, living as a steward in times of flux recommends a certain discipline of attention. There is a contagion of panic that spreads in networks. When one person acts as though the world is collapsing, others echo the rhythm. To resist this contagion, cultivate practices that widen your temporal horizon. Read histories that show the cyclical nature of many crises. Keep a ledger of personal recoveries. Practice temporal stretching, deliberately imagining plausible scenarios 5 and 10 years out, both bleak and hopeful, to inoculate the mind from short-term reactivity. These exercises are not prophecies. They are containment strategies that reduce the brain's appetite for catastrophic simulation by offering more realistic, plural narratives. Emotionally, the steward must also learn to grieve intermediate losses without being overwhelmed by them. Grief, here, is not only the great bereavement of death, but the recognition of small endings that precede larger transformations. A team disbanding, a career pivot, a friendship changing shape. Each small ending deserves its ritual, its marker. We undervalue brief rites. A workplace could mark the departure of a project with a simple acknowledgement session that celebrates what was learned. Families could institute goodbye ceremonies for seasons rather than only for major losses. Rituals compress meaning into moments and, by doing so, help societies and individuals process change without being structurally broken by it. Yet the human capacity for ritual is uneven. Many modern spaces have lost communal rites that were once social glue. Reviving ritual does not mean returning to archaic forms. It means inventing contemporary practices that signal transitions and hold people through them. A community might create a seasonal repair fair where neighbors bring broken objects for shared mending. A company might have a failure festival where teams present what failed and what it taught them. A city could run public forums where citizens rehearse disaster responses, turning preparedness into a civic habit rather than an anxiety-producing checklist. Ritual is technology. It structures emotion so that we are not thrown into rawness each time change arrives. Creativity emerges continuously within stewardship because constraints shape form. When you accept that you cannot make a thing permanent, you start to design for temporality. Modular houses, reparable electronics, business models that prioritize reparability and circularity. These are creative acts that respond to uncertainty not by feudal control but by resilient design. The aesthetics of temporality celebrate the beauty of repair. Kintsugi, the Japanese art of mending pottery with gold, is a literal and metaphoric image. Brokenness made part of beauty. When societies adopt such metaphors publicly, they cultivate a culture where scars are not stigmas but narratives of survival. Interpersonal life requires a specific kind of skill, the practice of contractual humility. Many conflicts arise from implicit contracts, unspoken expectations about roles, contributions, and outcomes. Contractual humility makes those assumptions explicit, negotiable, and revisable. It treats agreements as living documents. For example, partners might write a rotating list of household responsibilities and revisit it quarterly. Work teams might draft charters that include clauses for renegotiation when circumstances change. These mundane bureaucratic adaptations are not bureaucratic for their own sake. They reduce the psychic load of guessing and blame. They convert resentment into actionable items and make the everyday logistics of life less brittle. There is also a spiritual humility embedded in stewardship, the sense that you are stewarding something that is not ultimately yours. Whether you name it God, nature, community, or history, this larger frame reframes arrogance. It reduces the ego's appetite for control and expands the sense of responsibility. Practices that cultivate this humility range from religious observance to regular time in nature, to reading literature that situates one's life within broader arcs. These practices do not require belief in metaphysical claims. They require a willingness to see oneself as part of ongoing stories, rather than as their author alone. As we think about institutions again, consider education. Schools that train young people to be stewards as well as achievers will alter social dynamics. Curricula that include project-based learning with longevity, where students undertake projects that extend beyond the semester and require community involvement. Teach responsibility for future consequences. Teaching repair skills, financial literacy that includes planning for failure, and civic rituals for collective decision-making create citizens equipped for uncertainty. Education that orients towards stewardship produces less brittle adults because their first model of success is not conquest but care. Economics must adapt too. Capitalism in its current form often fetishizes growth and short-term gains, creating incentives that amplify fragility. Alternative economic models, cooperatives, social enterprises, mission-driven public entities can internalize the costs of resilience. Policy can encourage these models through tax incentives, grants, and procurement rules that privilege durability and communal benefit over instant profit. In practical terms, this might mean public grants for repair cafes, subsidies for retrofitting buildings for repairability, or procurement preferences for vendors who offer durable, reparable goods. All of these systems and practices accomplish something subtle. They change the moral grammar of failure. When brokenness is treated as shameful and terminal, people hide problems until they become catastrophic. When failure is normalized as an early-stage data point in iteration, when public and private spaces encourage disclosure, learning, and repair, then people ask for help earlier and systems adjust before collapse. This change of grammar is cultural and requires deliberate cultivation through storytelling, policy, and ritual. At the individual edge, a practice called incremental exposure is powerful. Choose areas where your fear of loss has paralyzed action and take a series of small steps into discomfort with built-in safety nets. If you fear career change, start with a small freelance project. If you fear intimacy, begin with a brief moment of honesty in a trusted conversation. Each small exposure recalibrates confidence and teaches that you can survive the consequences of provisional choices. Over time, a compounding effect appears. The person who has practiced incremental exposure becomes less brittle and more willing to take ethically considered risks. Finally, in the stillness before sleep, or in a long walk at the edge of town, carry these questions like a lantern. What are you stewarding that you never named as such? What small acts of maintenance have you let slide because they seemed unimportant? Which relationships require ritualized care you have not given? How might you redesign some corner of your life to make failure reparable and to invite others into the work? These questions are invitations to start small and to imagine large. The season of uncertainty is not a one-time test. It is an ongoing discipline. It asks us to relearn old virtues under new conditions. It demands that we cultivate patience, structure experiments within caretaking, invent rituals that reduce shame, and design institutions that make surrender a shared, safe practice rather than a privatized gamble. To inhabit this discipline is to become not merely a survivor of flux, but a maker of durable worlds in which fragility is not erased but understood, tended, and woven into a narrative that holds life's relentless changes with dignity. There is a particular intelligence that grows out of repeated encounters with surprise, not the brittle, reactive cunning of someone who learns only to hide their vulnerabilities, but a quieter, deeper wisdom that recognizes patterns without mistaking them for guarantees. This intelligence is slow. It accrues like sediment. It is the knowledge that your plans are instruments, not identities, that your certainties are scaffolding to be taken down when the building needs reshaping. It is learned in the small humiliations and secret recoveries, the relationship that weathered a betrayal by being honest instead of defensive, the business that pivoted when its market shifted instead of doubling down on denial, the body that was attended to after years of neglect and began, against odds, to heal. There is no single moment of revelation. There is a long apprenticeship to living with precariousness. Apprenticeship requires teachers, and our teachers are sometimes not human. Time itself instructs. The recurring seasons, human flourishing and decline, the way cities rebuild after storms, they are pedagogy in motion. Nature's rhythms teach patience, the inevitability of cycles, and the value of timing. The seasons do not plead or explain. They simply unfold. When we learn from them, we adopt a temporal humility. We stop expecting permanent summer and accept that preparation matters for whatever weather arrives. This humility is not defeat but discipline. It trains attention to the long game, to rhythms that outlast any single ego. There is also a classroom of peers. People who have been through loss teach by presence. You recognize them by certain gestures. They do not boast of having been unbroken. They speak of repair. They have reputations for showing up. This social lineage, not of heroic invulnerability but of faithful attendance, is one of the most reliable sources of what I will call durable hope. Durable hope is not the unshakable optimism that denies suffering. It is a steady competence to act with meaning in imperfect circumstances. It is taught by people who have been small and who still choose to love, to create, and to build again. Philosophically, this is where notions of agency get complicated. Many ethical systems valorize decisive action as the apex of virtue. But when action is divorced from an honest appraisal of contingency, it can be reckless. The moral imagination that serves us in precarious times is a hybrid. It contains both courage and constraint. Courage without constraint risks harm. Constraint without courage becomes cowardice. Wisdom is the calibration between the two. Practically, calibration looks like asking, before acting, 3 questions. What do I know? What do I not know? Who will be affected and how? This triple check is not paralysis. It is the prelude to responsible risk-taking. The interior life has its own architecture that supports this calibration. habits of attention, rituals of return, practices of confession and celebration. Attention, trained not merely as focus but as discriminating care, allows us to notice early signs of trouble and to savor small gains. Rituals of return, a weekly meal with a friend, a monthly letter to oneself, a yearly day of accounting for losses and lessons, create anchor points when chaos threatens to dissolve continuity. Confession, in its secular form, is the willingness to name errors publicly and to accept counsel. Celebration is the underrated twin of repair, acknowledging survival matters. Small celebrations stitch together a sense of progress in a nonlinear life. There is a particular moral beauty in reciprocal apology. Apologies that include acknowledgement, responsibility, reparation, and a plan to change are practices that transform relationships from brittle contracts into living covenants. When apology is modeled in families, organizations, and nations, it cultivates a civic muscle, the ability to admit wrong and to redesign structures that enabled it. This is neither sentimental nor utopian. It is pragmatic. Societies that institutionalize mechanisms of apology and repair reduce cycles of resentment and create a baseline trust that allows for more daring collective action. Creativity and purpose are other currencies in precarious times. People who find a meaningful project, not as distraction but as devoted labor that connects to others, tend to weather uncertainty better. Meaning anchors action. Purpose directs energy, but purpose must be flexible. A fixed purpose that ignores changing realities can become fanaticism. Thus, the trick is to bind your actions to values rather than to a single outcome. If your value is care, your work might shift forms across a lifetime. Pediatrics, elder care, mentoring, policy work. Values provide continuity without enforcing a brittle script. Economically and politically, the ethic of flexibility requires redistribution of risk. Societies that offload risk onto the least powerful produce fragile populations and brittle polities. A humane polity accepts some collective responsibility for individual precarities through healthcare, education, unemployment insurance, progressive taxation, and community investment. This is not charity. It is infrastructural prudence. When people know that a fall will not be fatal, they are more likely to take creative, societally beneficial risks. Insurance against ruin is not a luxury for the timid. It is an accelerator for innovation. On the subject of innovation, there is a moral obligation for creators and technologists to design with failure and repair in mind. Products that are planned obsolescent, systems that are opaque and unaccountable, algorithms that encode brittle assumptions, these are ethical failures disguised as progress. A counter-ethic insists on reparability, transparency, and participatory governance of technologies. Designing for failure is not pessimism. It is realism, and realism is the soil out of which durable flourishing grows. Emotionally, we must cultivate what I will call eloquent steadiness. It is the capacity to feel sorrow and gratitude simultaneously, to be avidly alive while acknowledging fragility. It resists the polarities of numbing or frantic optimism. Eloquent steadiness is felt in a quiet morning when one holds a cup of tea thinking of loss and possibility in the same breath. It can be taught through practices that combine reflection with action. Keeping a gratitude ledger that includes small hardships learned from, performing acts of kindness that are low stakes but generative, and rehearsing verbal gratitude toward those who have been steady. The moral imagination can also be sharpened by narrative practice. Rewrite one chapter of your life with generosity. Narrate a past failure as a complex story where both agency and contingency played roles. Then imagine a plausible future 10 years from now that includes both losses and joys. Narrative practice trains you to be the author of interpretations rather than the hostage of your initial readings. It does not invent facts. It reframes them into stories that allow repair and agency. At the edge of ethics and interior work is a social skill, curiosity-driven conflict. Many conflicts escalate because parties aim to win rather than to understand. Curiosity-driven conflict treats disagreement as diagnostic. What does this conflict reveal about unmet needs, hidden assumptions, or systemic pressures? It converts adversaries into diagnostic partners. Institutions can enforce this practice by creating norms and formats, mediations, restorative circles, structured rebuttal times that make conflict generative rather than destructive. Finally, ask radical but tender questions of yourself. What small truths are you unwilling to speak that, if voiced, would free energy for better work or relationships? Whose vulnerability could you bear today that you have been avoiding? What experiment could you try that is reversible and would expand your capacity for risk? These questions are not self-improvement slogans. They are invitations to apprenticeship. There is no endpoint to this work. The world's unpredictability will keep renewing itself with new shocks. The question is not whether you will be surprised, but how you will practice being surprised. Will you meet surprise with a tightened fist or an outstretched hand? Will you hoard certainty like a scarce good, or will you learn the art of making small assurances? Tending a garden, keeping a ritual, showing up for another's sorrow, saying "I don't know" without shame? These modest arts accumulate into a character suited for uncertain times. They do not guarantee safety, but they guarantee readiness. Readiness to repair, to love, to imagine, and to build again. There is a certain hush that falls when people stop pretending that they can fix every problem with a single decision. It is not quiet in the sense of resignation, but the kind of hush that precedes careful speech. In that hush, leadership shifts, not away from responsibility but toward stewardship of conversation. The most dangerous forms of control are those that insist decisions are final, that dissent is disloyalty, that complexity is an obstacle rather than a resource. When we accept uncertainty as a condition rather than an embarrassment, we open a different grammar for how power is exercised. Deliberation becomes a skill worth protecting, transparency a moral requirement, and the capacity to change course an ethical obligation. This is not soft governance. It is governance that recognizes fallibility and designs for correction rather than concealment. Imagine a room where policy is made and imagine how it sounds when people can say, honestly and in public, "We tried this and it failed. Here's what we learned." That sound is rare because institutions are often structured to punish admission. Yet the simple act of naming a mistake is catalytic. It diffuses shame, invites collective intelligence, and shortens the arc between error and repair. The cultures that cultivate such admissions deliberately create scripts for it. Standard postmortems where blame is discouraged and causality is mapped, safe channels for whistleblowing that do not destroy careers, and public forums where leaders model vulnerability without abdicating responsibility. These are technologies of trust. Trust is not built from charisma alone. It is engineered through predictable practices that allow people to anticipate repair rather than fear retribution. Trust, once built, is the social lubricant of adaptive systems. Without it, communities ossify into defensive silos. With it, they exchange risk and cushion failures. But trust is not evenly distributed. It is created in small acts. Showing up on time, keeping promises, admitting ignorance, following through on promises to repair. Leadership that aspires to resilience invests in these acts because they compound. A CEO who apologizes and creates a real plan for restitution fosters more innovation than one who spins narratives to protect status. A teacher who admits a flawed syllabus invites students into co-creation instead of passive consumption. The pedagogy of humility transforms both institutions and psyches. Yet there is a tension here because humility, when moralized, can be used as domination. Be humble can become a means of silencing demands for justice. The language of surrender must therefore be paired with the language of accountability. To surrender control does not mean to accept abuse. It means to choose inquiries and relationships in which vulnerability does not become fodder for exploitation. This requires boundaries that are clear and enforced, and infrastructures that mediate power, unions, legal protections, transparent processes. The ethical frontier is to cultivate spaces where people can be fallible without being disposable. Power's redistribution is not only political but technical. The infrastructures we build, algorithms, platforms, networks, reflect moral choices about centralization and redundancy. Centralized systems promise efficiency but concentrate points of failure. Decentralized systems offer resilience but can be chaotic without shared norms. The moral engineering challenge is to balance coordination with redundancy. Design systems that can route around damage, that have clear accountability, and that make failure visible in ways that enable repair. Engineers need ethicists. Policymakers need technicians. Communities need channels to contest technological decisions. Democratic oversight of technology is not a luxury but an existential necessity in a world where opaque systems can amplify harms at scale. Loneliness, in this context, is not merely an emotional state but a structural signal. When people feel they must perform competence at all times, when institutions reward solitary achievement and hide scaffolding, loneliness becomes a side effect of efficiency. The opposite architecture is one where scaffolding is visible and normal. Mentorship, apprenticeship, mutual aid networks, and shared public projects make interdependence legible. They say, in practice, we build together, we will fail together, we will repair together. This visibility reduces shame and increases the likelihood that people will ask for help before a crisis becomes catastrophic. It also reshapes identity. Success is no longer an index of solitary prowess, but a testimony to collective competence. There is a tender pedagogy that arises from thinking of identity as a communal artifact. Children learn from models, not aphorisms. When they witness adults negotiating uncertainty with curiosity and modesty, they internalize a grammar of adaptive living. Parenting that models saying, "I don't know," and then holding the exploration that follows is more instructive than 1,000 admonitions, to be sure. Schools that teach project-based learning, with public exhibitions of failure and iteration, produce graduates who are not brittle in the face of change. Culture, in the end, matters more than rules. The stories we tell on screens, in conversations, in classrooms, become blueprints for how people imagine their place in a world that resists total control. Storytelling is also a moral technology because it allows us to rehearse alternate responses to suffering. Fiction trains the mind to live in others' dilemmas. Biographies offer moral exemplars of humility and repair. Journalism that centers systems and contexts over sensational personalities invites empathy for complex causes. If we want a populace capable of tolerating uncertainty without succumbing to cynicism, we must invest in narratives that privilege nuance and that foreground repair. This is not about polishing a veneer of positivity. It is about curating tales that make endurance legible and admirable. At the level of daily life, the practices that support this broad ethos are small and cumulative. Make room in your calendar for unstructured time. It is often in this slack that recombination and synthesis occur. Cultivate friendships that have rituals of checking in. A weekly call, a text at a set hour, a group that meets to share ongoing struggles. Learn the grammar of appreciative inquiry. Ask others what they value and how you can support it, rather than assuming you know. Practice planned transparency. Share your constraints and unknowns early in a collaboration so that others can adjust and offer help. These are mundane techniques, but they shift the social atmosphere from competitive performance to collaborative experimentation. Creativity remains a keystone because it is the engine of adaptation. But creativity flourishes in conditions that combine freedom with constraint. Too much freedom produces a swamp of choices. Too much constraint stifles imagination. The sweet spot is where modest constraints, time limits, materials, audience expectations, provide a frame within which imagination must find novel ways to operate. Organizations that cultivate such structures, design sprints, artist residencies, cohort-based learning, accelerate the learning cycle. They also democratize innovation because they provide low-risk arenas where diverse people can try, fail, and contribute. There is a private moral labor that must accompany public practices, the work of aligning desire with capacity. Desire often outsizes capacity. We want to be all things to all people, to excel in infinite arenas. Part of mature humility is triage, choosing a few domains in which to invest deeply and letting others be. This is not sloth. It is strategic allocation of attention. It requires a practice of saying no, not as a refusal to help, but as a way to keep promises that matter. Saying no intentionally is a form of ethical stewardship. You preserve the quality of what you have promised by limiting the quantity of your commitments. Conflict is an unavoidable teacher in this landscape because differences of desire and risk tolerance are natural. How we argue matters. Adopt formats that turn conflict into information rather than punishment. Structured debates that require ruling by shared criteria, restorative circles that seek harm repair, and collaborative problem-solving sessions that start with shared facts are techniques that transform friction into forward motion. These formats require facilitation skills, listening, naming dynamics, and keeping the conversation focused on outcomes. They are not easy, but they are learnable, and they create cultures where disagreement does not default to fracture. There is also the matter of personal narrative, which we return to because it shapes how we respond to everything else. A life story that treats setbacks as proof of unworthiness will react to surprise with paranoia. A story that frames setbacks as data to be interpreted invites curiosity and action. You can practice rewriting narrative by keeping a resilience ledger, a journal where you catalog not just achievements but recoveries, those times you were knocked off course and still found a way to continue. Rereading that ledger when anxiety spikes is a prophylactic against despair. It is evidence that you are capable of repair. And then, gently, we must address mercy. Mercy is not only interpersonal, it is civic. Policies and practices that allow for second chances, education access for formerly incarcerated people, pathways back to employment after illness, bankruptcy laws that allow reorganization rather than permanent ruin, are institutional mercies that transform fragile lives into recoverable ones. Mercy reduces the fear that one failure is an irreversible sentence. It allows people to risk for the community's sake without the terror of permanent exclusion. Mercy is therefore an investment in social capital. When people know they will be supported in recovery, they are more likely to innovate and less likely to hoard. Hold a question like a lantern and walk with it. In what arenas of your life have you been trained to hide failure? And what would change if you practiced public repair instead? What small structural changes could you introduce to your household, workplace, or neighborhood that would make vulnerability less dangerous and more useful? Imagine the moral contour of a community where people routinely admit ignorance, ask for help, and participate in repair. What differences do you see in how people take risks, build, and love? These are not utopian fantasies. They are imaginaries that guide practical experiments. The illusion of control is not abolished by this work. It will return like a familiar tune. But the melody changes when you learn to play accompaniment rather than insist on solo performance. You will still want certainty at times. That is human. The task is not to renounce the comfort of control completely, but to enlarge your repertoire so that you can alternate between leading and following, deciding and asking, planning and improvising. The aim is not to become omniscient, but to become a better steward of what you can influence and a more generous participant in what you cannot. The world will always surprise you. The question remains, will your surprise be met with a rigid script of despair, or with a practiced curiosity that, in its humility, invites others to co-create the next move? There is a subtle economy to courage that most people misunderstand. It is not the loud clamor of certainty, but the quiet willingness to be seen in an unfinished state. Courage often arrives as a small decision, to say a soft truth, to lift a hand when help is needed, to admit you do not have the answer, and then to persist in that posture. When the illusion of control is strong, courage masquerades as confidence and arrogance. When control loosens, courage must wear a different garment, one that is stitched from humility, curiosity, and a readiness for repair. This kind of courage changes the texture of relationships and institutions because it reframes power as something to be exercised with accountability rather than hoarded as armor. Consider how this looks in everyday life. A leader who practices this courage will invite critique, not as a rite of humiliation, but as fuel for learning. They will create forums where dissent is not punished but studied. A partner will say, "I am scared," and then propose a modest experiment to test a new way of being together. A teacher will declare an error and then use it to model how to recover. These are small acts, but they accumulate. They teach people that being fallible is not disqualifying but qualifying for deeper connection. In such a world, the default aspiration is not to be unassailable but to be trustworthy, a different, healthier ambition. Loneliness, in its deepest form, is not merely the absence of others, but the absence of trustworthy reciprocity. Trustworthy reciprocity is the practice of matching vulnerability with care rather than with exploitation. Building it requires social designs that make mutual aid a habit rather than an emergency. Imagine neighborhoods organized around routine mutual support, regular skill shares, rotating care rosters, communal meals that are ordinary as grocery trips. Imagine workplaces that pay for sabbaticals, that normalize phased returns after burnout, that publish after-action reports including failures and the learning gleaned. These designs do not require utopian spirits. They require administrative courage and cultural reframing. We can fund what we value. Creativity, when nourished by communal scaffolding, becomes a form of public repair. Artists and inventors need not be solitary eccentrics. They can be nodes in networks of feedback and support. The fierce myth of genius as lone genius is convenient for someone selling a narrative of self-sufficiency, but it impoverishes the possibilities of collaborative invention. If we reframe creativity as distributed, as a conversation between maker, audience, tools, and history, then the structures that nurture it shift. Grant systems that fund collaborative prototypes, public spaces for showing early work, educational models that pair novice and master in long-term apprenticeships. These structures make failure less lethal and experimentation more common. There is a practice I want to name because it is both subtle and powerful: reciprocal naming. In many relationships and groups, we perform an ongoing ritual of mutual definition. We label others by roles, past actions, or reputations. Reciprocal naming is the deliberate practice of offering each other names that include possibility. You are a thoughtful person who sometimes misses the forest for the trees, but who listens when invited. Or you are brave and also scared today. These small redescriptions interrupt fossilized identities that imprison people in narrow patterns. They make room for change by acknowledging both current tendencies and potentiality. When practiced in groups, it transforms culture because people start to expect revision rather than final judgment. On a larger scale, policy and law can institutionalize practices that protect the dignity of experimentation. Consider regulatory sandboxes that allow startups to test novel services with oversight and rollback plans rather than exposing citizens to untested harms. Consider bankruptcy and social safety nets designed not as final punishments but as bridges to re-entry. Design laws that favor repair over replacement, extended warranties, repair-friendly product standards, right-to-repair clauses, and you change markets. These are technocratic levers, but they are moral choices. They decide whether society will lean into fragility with care or pretend it away with brittle optimism. There is a spiritual exercise that sits at the boundary between self-care and civic imagination, the practice of elegy and dedication. Integrating caregiving into public life, these are policy choices with moral gravity. Care is not charity. It is social infrastructure. Communities that invest in care share risk, reduce shame, and increase the space for people to take non-catastrophic risks that generate collective growth. The interior horizon also requires concrete practices. Begin with attunement, regular check-ins with your body and your intentions. Ask yourself what tension you are holding and what promise you are trying to keep. Translate that into a small action: a conversation, a boundary, a confession, a repair. Small acts compound. Keep a ledger of these interventions and revisit it monthly. Notice patterns. Where do you habitually over-control and why? Where do you abdicate and what fear underlies that abdication? Naming the patterns creates leverage, because once they are visible, you can experiment on them. Conflict remains unavoidable, but it can be generative when reframed as information. Practice curiosity-driven confrontation. Enter disputes with the intention of mapping interests rather than scoring points. Use structured formats, time-limited speaking turns, reflection pauses, and summarizing back what you heard to prevent escalation. Teach these formats in institutions so they become cultural equipment rather than improvisational feats. The result is not the absence of conflict, but a thicker, more useful ecology of disagreement. Loneliness and its twin, shame, are social pathologies that need public remedies as well as private work. Community rituals that make vulnerability ordinary, public story nights, communal acknowledgments of hardship, open forums for confessions followed by shared repair, reduce the stealth of shame. When shame is not a solitary prison but a visible, communal problem, it loses its corrosive power. This is why public storytelling matters. Narratives of repair humanize suffering and model pathways back to belonging. There is one more practice at the intersection of philosophical clarity and psychological efficacy: the art of micro-commitments. Rather than pledging wholesale transformations, I will always stay calm. Make tiny, repeatable promises. Tomorrow I will ask one curious question in a conversation. Or, this week I will share a draft and solicit feedback. Micro-commitments are low-cost experiments that shift neural pathways and social expectations. Over months, they rewire habits and reputations. They make courage and vulnerability habitual because they reduce the stakes and allow for repeated success. Ask yourself now, not as a test, but as a tender exploration. Where could you introduce micro-commitments that would change the shape of a relationship or a work process? Who in your circle could you offer a reciprocal naming to, just to see what happens? What small policy at your workplace or in your local community could protect experimentation and repair? Imagine the ripple effects if everyone made one tiny promise to lower the stakes of failure and to raise the availability of repair. To live this way is to accept that you will sometimes be wrong, sometimes exposed, sometimes hurt. It is also to accept that you will sometimes witness astonishing repairs, unexpected kindnesses, and creations that arise precisely because risk was taken in a culture that supported recovery. The world that nurtures such outcomes is not the product of utopia but of steady, often boring work, the meetings where people practice admitting error, the fund that supports repair cafes, the city ordinance that mandates transparency in AI, the family ritual that marks transitions. These are infrastructural, cumulative, and mundane. They are the small scaffolds on which durable flourishing is built. Hold these questions loosely and let them circulate. What small scaffolds can you help build in the world you inhabit? Where can you be more generous with names, with expectations, with the space for others to be unfinished? Who needs a micro-commitment from you that would make them willing to experiment rather than hide? The answers will not come as proclamations. They will come as quiet choices. Make one today. There is a late-night truth about living with uncertainty that arrives soft and uncompromising. You are always learning to die to versions of yourself, not in a melodramatic way, but in the quiet, iterative sense that pieces of identity, the job title, the neighborhood, the assumed horizon, will fall away and you must, again and again, assemble a self from what remains. This process is laborious and sometimes lonely, because identity feels like a refuge. To name yourself is to create an island in a sea that otherwise feels endless. When tides rise, islands erode. The task is neither to erect an impregnable fortress nor to dissolve into whatever passes by, but to become portable, to carry coherence with you while letting forms change. Portability of self has an ethics. It asks you to invest less in brittle badges and more in durable capacities. The capacity to tend relationships, to learn, to repair mistakes, to tell a story about your life that includes failure without letting it be final. These capacities are not glamorous, but they are the currency of a resilient life. They are learned in repetition. The apology given when pride would prefer silence. The small restorative action taken when bitterness would prefer withdrawal. The morning practice that steadies you when news arrives that would otherwise scatter you. Over years, these repetitions become habits, and habits become the architecture of a person who can be surprised without being broken. There is another truth. Vulnerability is not a contingency you toggle on and off, but a muscle you can train. The training is practical, mundane, and sometimes humiliating. Tell a small truth in a conversation and notice the world. Often nothing catastrophic happens. Share a half-formed idea and watch how it invites collaboration rather than ridicule. Ask for help and observe that most people reciprocate in ways that are awkward but real. These small exposures, repeated, build a tolerance for being seen. They also create networks of reciprocity. People who have been allowed to be imperfect are more likely to extend the same grace. That is how communities knit resilience into their social fabric. Yet vulnerability without boundaries is not virtue. It is a kind of martyrdom. The discernment about when to expose and when to protect is part of practical wisdom. Boundaries are not walls. They are selective gates that conserve energy for relationships that matter and for experiments that have communal sanction. A boundary may be a time allotment for work, a refusal to answer calls at midnight, or an agreement with a partner about how and when feedback is delivered. These practices do not deny interdependence. They make it sustainable. They teach us that surrender and self-preservation are not opposites but necessary companions. When systems fail us, when institutions designed for stability betray us through neglect or cruelty, the question shifts from personal repair to collective redress. There is a moral calculus here. One might practice individual resilience while simultaneously demanding structural change. Resilience should not be an excuse for systemic abdication. To be a citizen in uncertain times is therefore twofold. Practice your own repair and insist that public goods, safety nets, and community scaffolds exist so that private repair is not the only option. This is the political spine of ethics, the recognition that some people cannot afford the luxury of incremental experiments and that societies must structure safety so that experimentation and surrender do not become privileges. Creativity, when summoned under pressure, often appears like a small, stubborn miracle. Faced with constraints, people find ways to recombine resources, to tell new stories, and to assemble meaning from broken shards. But creativity without audience withers. The act of making requires others to complete its purpose. The maker needs witness, critique, and sometimes the blunt proof of consumption. Cultivating audiences that are generous and honest is therefore a civic task. Book clubs, public readings, open studio nights, neighborhood show and tells. These are not frivolous entertainments. They are scaffolds that allow experiments to be risked and refined. In a society that rewards only polished demonstration, the early, ragged stages of creation are starved. Nourish the early stages and you nourish persistence. There is a psychological architecture that supports this interplay between solitude and sharing, the triadic support model. It is simple. Maintain at least 3 relational modalities for any major life domain: a teacher or mentor, a peer group, and a person who survives you emotionally, a close friend or partner. The mentor offers distance and wisdom. The peer group offers mutual experiment and humility. The survivor offers the intimacy that can hold your worst days without calculating future utility. This triangulation prevents any single relationship from becoming the sole repository of your worth and distributes risk in a humane way. On the level of habit, cultivate what I will call preparedness practices. These are not survivalist stockpiles, but small routines that increase your margin for error. A weekly hour of bill review, a quarterly conversation about expectations with key people in your life, an annual audit of skills you might need if circumstances shift. Preparedness reduces panic because it inserts small certainties into an uncertain world. It is not a dream of omnipotence. It is an economy of small assurances. Forgiveness, again, deserves attention not as a moral platitude but as pragmatic infrastructure. When people can forgive in ways that include accountability, they free psychic bandwidth for creativity and care. Forgiveness helps communities recycle social capital that would otherwise fossilize into grievance. The practice is hard, messy, and sometimes politically fraught. There are harms that require restitution and consequences. But when forgiveness is part of a structured process that includes truth-telling and reparation, it becomes a tool for resilient social life. And there is solitude, not as isolation but as disciplined replenishment. Solitude oriented toward reflection, reading, walking, and small creative acts is prophylactic against the attrition of constant performance. It is a furnace in which identity is reheated and tested. But solitude must not calcify into withdrawal. It should circle back into relationship, bringing refined capacity rather than brittle retreat. Schedule your seasons of solitude like you schedule meetings. Treat them as essential maintenance, not elective luxury. Ask yourself, in the quiet of a late evening, which parts of your life do you treat as belongings rather than responsibilities? Which attachments have hardened into dogmas that no longer serve you? Where do you feel a hunger to create but a shortage of witness? Name one small micro-commitment you can make tonight. Send a draft, start a repair ritual, call an old friend, declare a boundary, and then do it. The accumulation of modest acts will reconfigure the scaffolding of your days more reliably than infrequent, grand resolutions. Finally, hold this paradox. Surrender makes room for agency. When you stop pretending to control everything, you often find more energy for the things you truly can influence. The surrender is not an end but an opening. It clears the clutter of impossible certainties and allows a truer, more soulful work to be done. The life that results is imperfect and fragile, yes, but it is also more honest, more connected, and more capable of creating meaning that survives the next inevitable change. The end of a long conversation about control and surrender does not feel like a rival so much as a gentle closing of a book you have been reading with an old friend. There is neither triumph nor defeat in this motion. There is the peculiar relief of having traced the contours of a wound and, together, learned a few salves. To conclude is not to finish the work of living with uncertainty. That work will continue until the last breath, but to gather the lessons into a light pack you can carry into whatever weather comes next. Notice the difference between control as mastery and control as care. Mastery wants dominion, care wants endurance. To desire mastery in all things is to set yourself an impossible exam. To desire care is to build systems, relationships, and inner habits that make durable life possible. That single pivot from domination to stewardship changes the moral grammar of choices. It reframes ambition as a responsibility to future others rather than as a private inventory of trophies. Second, practice the small economies of relinquishment. These are not dramatic renunciations, but micro-releases that accumulate. Give away a habit of certainty. Say, I don't know, once a day, and let the silence be productive. Hand over a task to someone else and watch what grows in your absence. Let one minor plan go unpolished and accept the messy consequences. Each relinquishment is a rehearsal for larger surrenders. Each one trains the nervous system not to equate loosened control with annihilation. The psychological effect is cumulative. Less shame, more curiosity, a softer tolerance for surprise. Third, invest in visible scaffolding. Hide not the help you accept or the aid you give. A culture that normalizes scaffolding, mentors, apprenticeships, mutual aid rosters, transparent postmortems, changes loneliness into mutual labor. Make your dependencies legible. When you admit who you lean on and who leans on you, you create a network that shares load rather than burying it. The political corollary is clear. Design institutions that make scaffolding accessible not only to those who can pay for it, but to everyone who needs it. Fourth, work the somatic seam. Ideas alone do not steady the body in the face of a storm. Breath, touch, ritualized movement, communal presence. These are the tools that rewire reactivity into resilience. Practice them with the same seriousness you would a professional skill. Teach children how to breathe through panic. Teach offices how to pause and recalibrate. Make public spaces that allow for bodily repair. The body remembers patterns long after the mind forgets principles. Tend it with patience. Fifth, cultivate narrative generosity. The stories you tell about yourself and others determine what you permit to be possible. Tell stories that include failure as a chapter, not as the title. Offer others descriptions that leave room for growth. Narrative generosity is a political act as well as a personal one. When societies retell their histories with nuance, including the harms done and the reparations made, they create space for collective repair. Practice rewriting one story in your life with more compassion. Notice how the emotional climate shifts. Sixth, make institutions that assume fallibility. Design policy, workplaces, and technologies with defaults of transparency, reversibility, and redundancy. Reward repair work. Fund play and low-stakes experimentation. Remove the penalties for early disclosure of mistakes. The technical choices we make about design, from product lifespans to data portability, are moral choices about what kind of world we want to inhabit. One that expects perfection or one that prepares for repair. Seventh, train the social muscles that match vulnerability with dignity. Teach apology that includes restitution. Train listening that resists immediate judgment. Normalize renegotiation over retribution. These are civic arts as much as interpersonal ones. They require curricula in schools, rituals in workplaces, and practices in families. The more we practice these arts, the more likely we will be to turn conflict into information and breakdown into repair. Eighth, steward your attention. In an economy that loves spectacle and punishes pause, tending attention is a radical act. Choose what you will watch, what you will argue about, who you will be present with. Let your calendar reflect the life you value rather than the anxieties you fear. Micro-commitments, the small, visible promises you make and keep, rewire reputation and habit. Keep a few, keep them well, and the cumulative trust they build will be more valuable than 1,000 impressive but brittle accomplishments. Ninth, practice political imagination. Personal resilience is never a substitute for public care. Advocate for policies that make second chances real. Equitable education, healthcare, robust safety nets, right to repair laws, sensible technology governance. When people are less terrified of permanent ruin, they take creative risks that benefit the Commonwealth. A politics of surrender is not passivity. It is designing collective conditions that allow courageous, responsible risk-taking. Finally, accept the intimacy of not knowing as a gift more than as a curse. There is a peculiar generosity in the world's refusal to be fully possessed. It forces us to widen our attention, to bind ourselves to others, and to practice humility. The shocks that undo us also teach us to love with greater care because we understand that what we hold can be lost. Love practiced in the shadow of uncertainty is fiercer and more translational. It moves from sentiment to service, from fantasy of permanence to apprenticeship in tending. So what do you do tomorrow with these orientations? Start with one small scaffold. Make one micro-commitment. Tell one story differently. Breathe when a familiar panic arrives. And let your body show you how quickly a practice pause can change the inner calculus. Ask someone to name a way they need help and offer a single, specific time. In your work or community, initiate one ritual that celebrates repair rather than perfection. These are tiny, prosaic acts. And because they are tiny, they are repeatable. Repeat them. Keep a ledger, if you like, a modest list of small surrenders and the surprising gains they produced. As this narration closes, hold a few questions with curiosity, not as tests but as invitations. Which parts of your life are brittle because you mistake control for care? Where could visible scaffolding reduce shame and increase collaboration? What small ritual could you invent that teaches your body to welcome surprise without panic? How might you redesign one institution you touch, a classroom, a workplace, a family, so that failure becomes an early signal for repair and not a sentence of exclusion? The illusion of control will not be cured by philosophy alone, nor will surrender be discovered by willpower in a single night. The work is slow, communal, and practical. A choreography of tiny acts, public designs, and interior practices. It asks for courage of a quieter sort, the courage to be imperfect in public, to ask for help, to fail where it can be repaired. It asks for mercy, dignity, and imagination on political as well as personal levels. It requires that we make visible the scaffolding we all need and that we fund the institutions that normalize repair. In the end, perhaps the deepest paradox is this: the more we learn to loosen our grip on the illusion of total control, the more agency we find in the only place agency can truly flourish, in the shared, supple practices that let us act well together. The life that remains, uncertain, communal, full of grief and bright with small joys, is not a lesser life. It is the life that remembers how to arrive at a table where hands are offered and plates are passed, where mistakes are mended rather than buried, and where courage wears the clothes of curiosity and care. Carry that image with you. A table set in the wind, people gathered, hands ready to help right the overturned cup. The storm will come again. The table will need constant tending, and so will you.